The first indication that something was wrong came not from the wilderness, but from silence. On the morning of August 18, 2012, Marjorie Caldwell sat at the small oak table in her kitchen in Eugene, Oregon, staring at her phone as the minutes slipped past 9. Her daughter, Evelyn Hart, had promised to call by 8:30. Evelyn was not casual about promises. She was precise, punctual, and almost obsessively considerate. When she said she would call, she called. By 9:15, Marjorie's coffee had gone cold, and the silence had taken on weight. She dialed Evelyn's phone, then her husband's, again and again, listening to the hollow ring that ended each attempt. By 10, the fear had settled into her bones, with the certainty of something she could no longer deny. Evelyn Hart and her husband, Daniel Hart, had left 4 days earlier for a backcountry trek through the Granite Crown Range in northern Washington, a harsh and sparsely traveled region known more to seasoned alpinists than casual hikers. They were both in their early 30s, both experienced, both methodical to the point of irritation for some of their friends. They planned their trips with military thoroughness. Routes were mapped, contingencies discussed, gear lists checked and rechecked. Evelyn, a civil engineer by training, treated the wilderness with respect bordering on reverence. Daniel, quieter and more inward, had spent much of his youth climbing and scrambling through remote terrain, learning the language of stone and weather in ways few people ever bothered to understand. At 10:30, Marjorie called the Skagit County Sheriff's Office. She spoke calmly, giving names, dates, coordinates, the itinerary Evelyn had emailed before leaving. Deputy Alan Ruiz took the report and did what procedure required. He noted that the couple was technically not overdue yet. Backcountry permits listed their return for the following day. But when Marjorie mentioned the truck, his tone shifted. A ranger was dispatched to the Coldwater Pass trailhead. Within an hour, the ranger called back. The dark green Tacoma was still there, parked exactly where Daniel had indicated on the permit, locked, undisturbed. Pine needles collecting along the tires. By mid-afternoon, the situation had escalated. Ranger Leah Monroe stood at the trailhead, studying the truck through polarized lenses. Inside, everything looked normal, a paper map folded neatly on the dashboard. 2 water bottles empty but capped. Evelyn's field notebook tucked into the door pocket. There was no sign of haste, no sign of panic, nothing to suggest the couple had expected anything other than a routine return. The gear they had taken matched their plan exactly. 2 expedition packs, climbing rope, bivouac sacks, food for 5 days. No more, no less. The search began the next morning under clear skies. Helicopters swept the ridgelines, while ground teams fanned out along known routes and likely deviations. Dogs worked the lower valleys where scent might linger longer. The Granite Crown Range was unforgiving terrain, all fractured stone and steep bowls where weather could turn lethal in minutes. Still, conditions during the Hart's trip window had been ideal. No storms, no extreme cold, nothing that explained a complete disappearance. After 5 days, then 10, then 14, the search was scaled back. Not a scrap of fabric, not a dropped carabiner, not a footprint out of place. The mountains offered no answers. The case went cold quickly, as wilderness cases often did. Officially, Evelyn and Daniel Hart were listed as missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, they became one more story traded quietly among climbers, a cautionary tale stripped of details because there were none to tell. Marjorie refused to let it end there. She called every month, then every week. She wrote letters. She drove north twice a year and stood at the trailhead, staring into the trees as if the forest might eventually give something back. It never did. 3 years passed. On September 3, 2015, 2 climbers attempting an unlisted spur near Mount Alder made a discovery that shattered the quiet finality the case had settled into. Near the summit, where the rock flattened into a narrow crown of exposed granite, they noticed a pattern that did not belong. Stones placed too deliberately. A circle, almost perfectly round, built from jagged shale and basalt. At its center lay a shape wrapped in faded canvas, bound tightly with rope. The climbers did not touch it. They called for help and waited, the wind cutting across the summit as if trying to erase what had been done there. Recovery teams reached the site hours later. The arrangement was unlike anything they had seen. The stones were clean, lacking the lichen that coated the surrounding rock, suggesting intentional placement. The rope work was complex, technical, executed with confidence. When the canvas was opened, the remains inside were desiccated but intact, preserved by altitude and exposure. Dental records confirmed the identity within a day. Evelyn Hart had been found. The relief was short-lived. There was no sign of Daniel. The autopsy raised more questions than it answered. No clear trauma, no broken bones, no obvious cause of death. The binding appeared post-mortem, careful rather than violent. Whoever had arranged Evelyn's body had taken time, had known what they were doing, and had wanted her to remain exactly where she was placed. The stone circle was not concealment, it was presentation. Detective Simon Hale was assigned the case when it reopened. He was a methodical investigator with a reputation for patience and an aversion to convenient explanations. As he reviewed the original search files, then the photographs of the summit, one thought kept returning with uncomfortable persistence. This had not been done by the mountains. This had been done by a person. And whoever that person was knew Evelyn well enough to plan something this precise in a place so remote. As helicopters lifted Evelyn Hart's remains from the peak where she had been left, the Granite Crown Range returned to its usual indifference. Wind moved across stone. Clouds gathered and dispersed. But the silence that followed now was different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. Detective Simon Hale returned to Eugene with a folder thick with old reports, photographs, and maps. Yet the unease clung to him like a persistent fog. Something about the way Evelyn Hart's body had been arranged suggested more than an accident or a random misfortune. It whispered of intention. He started by retracing the Hart's movements in the days leading up to their disappearance. Their permits were meticulous, their itinerary precise, yet no logical explanation accounted for Daniel Hart's absence or Evelyn's mysterious demise. Hale's gut told him the answers lay not in the mountains themselves, but in the hands of someone who had used the mountains as a stage. The first clue emerged from a detail long overlooked. Among the gear recovered at the Coldwater Pass trailhead was a small leather journal belonging to Daniel Hart. Unlike Evelyn's precise, cleanly ruled field notebook, Daniel's journal was rougher, the pages scuffed and stained with faint traces of graphite and water. Hale leafed through it carefully. The journal contained hiking logs, climbing observations, weather notes, but beneath the technical entries, a pattern began to emerge. Sketches of the Granite Crown Range that were oddly specific, almost architectural in nature. Certain ridges were annotated with numbers, others marked with tiny circles and arrows. At first, Hale assumed Daniel had been mapping routes for climbing purposes, but the sketches seemed to reference locations no casual hiker would care to note: narrow ledges, isolated rock outcroppings, and hidden valleys that the Hart family never publicly discussed. Hale brought in forensic analyst Dr. Naomi Field, an expert in materials and microtraces. Her focus was on the rope used to bind Evelyn. "This isn't just climbing rope," she said, her eyes scanning high-resolution photographs of the fibers. "It's been pre-cut into specific lengths. See the abrasion marks? Deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly how they wanted each segment to perform. And look here. Stress patterns indicate repeated tension, like knots practiced and retied over time. She paused, letting the implications settle. This wasn't spontaneous. This was rehearsed. The detective next turned to handwriting analysis. Evelyn's notes were immaculately organized. Daniel's sketches and annotations were precise but personal, filled with idiosyncratic marks in shorthand. Hale engaged a document examiner, Dr. Leslie Crane, to compare the journals with the markings found at the summit and in recovered photographs of the stone circle. Crane's analysis was methodical, breaking each letter formation, pressure variation, and curve into measurable metrics. Within days, Crane reported back, Daniel Hart's hand was unmistakably behind the summit notations. There's no doubt. The stone placements correspond to his markings. Whoever constructed that circle followed his directions down to the inch. Hale's mind raced. If Daniel Hart had mapped the site with such precision, where was he now? And why leave Evelyn behind in such a bizarre arrangement? He began visiting local climbing shops and forums, hoping to locate anyone who might have noticed Daniel's meticulous tendencies. One elderly climbing instructor, Tom Eckhart, remembered Daniel from weekend classes. He was obsessed with planning, Tom said, shaking his head. Every route was measured, mapped, remeasured. I told him it was excessive, but he insisted precision mattered. While Hale pursued Daniel's known associates, forensic teams continued analysis at the summit. Microphotographs of the stones revealed faint traces of chalk and rope fibers not native to the surrounding area. Soil samples indicated footprints that didn't match typical hiking boots. The impressions were smaller, more deliberate, almost ceremonial in spacing. Every detail reinforced the impression of control, of deliberate staging. The stone circle was not merely a place for hiding a body, it was a performance. Someone had choreographed every element. Then came the breakthrough. Hale received a call from the local postal inspector. Daniel Hart's safety deposit box, accessed months earlier under procedural review, contained a sealed envelope addressed simply Granite Crown. Inside were two items, a detailed topographic map and a small compact climbing kit. The map was annotated with routes and landmarks, including exact locations of the stone circle and a series of notes in Daniel's writing. Hale examined it for hours, noting the precision. Each landmark was measured, every contour detailed. Certain annotations referenced unusual natural formations clearly intended for concealment rather than hiking. Hale began piecing together a timeline. The meticulous preparation, the pre-cut rope, the planning evident in both Daniel's journal and the map all pointed to a calculated event rather than a wilderness accident. He couldn't yet state motive or determine the exact method, but the evidence suggested someone had intended for Evelyn to be placed in the stone circle long before they reached the Granite Crown Range. Hale needed a psychological profile. He reached out to Dr. Angela Simons, a forensic psychologist familiar with ritualistic behaviors. The circle placement suggests symbolic intent, she explained. It's precise, repetitive, and isolating. Whoever did this sought to impose meaning or order. It may reflect control, grief, guilt, or obsession. But note the rehearsal, the pre-cut rope, mapping of the terrain. It's not random. This person operates rationally, but directed their rationality toward an irrational, disturbing act. Meanwhile, Hale coordinated a field reconstruction. He and Simons, alongside a small climbing team, ascended the peak to recreate the sequence leading to Evelyn's placement. Using Daniel's map and the recovered rope, they traced the steps. The climb was technically feasible, but it demanded significant preparation, physical stamina, and familiarity with the terrain. This wasn't accidental, Simon said, as they studied the final stone circle placement. It required rehearsal and intent. That's why we haven't found Daniel yet. He knows the mountain intimately. He could vanish again. The detective's suspicions were confirmed days later when a local hiker reported a man matching Daniel Hart's description near a remote ridge, roughly 20 miles from the summit. Surveillance footage from a nearby ranger station corroborated the sighting. Hale and his team mobilized immediately, but Daniel had vanished again, leaving behind only a faint trail of footprints and a series of carefully arranged cairns leading deeper into the wilderness. While the chase intensified, Hale dug into Daniel's personal life. Friends described a man quiet and exacting, devoted to his wife, yet increasingly withdrawn during the months before their trip. There were mentions of arguments over route planning, disagreements about risk, and growing frustration with the public attention Evelyn's professional work received. None of this was overtly threatening, but in combination with the field evidence, it suggested a man driven to extreme measures to control the outcome of his world. Back at the precinct, forensic reports from the summit returned with even more damning details. The rope fibers contained traces of wax and chalk, typically used for climbing practice, indicating Daniel had rehearsed knots multiple times before the trip. Soil analysis indicated some stones had been moved prior to placement, possibly to mark positions in advance. Even the vegetation surrounding the circle had been selectively trampled, suggesting a deliberate approach path that minimized exposure to observers or rescuers. Hale realized the magnitude of the case. This was no longer simply a missing person investigation. It was a meticulously staged act in which the mountains themselves had been used both as instrument and witness. Every step taken by Daniel Hart demonstrated foresight, planning, and rational action directed toward an irrational, destructive goal. The detective felt the first real pangs of clarity. The Granite Crown Range had not taken Evelyn. Someone had, and the evidence pointed squarely at her husband. The act closed as Hale stared at a wall covered in photographs, maps, and journal excerpts, the room lit only by a single desk lamp. He traced a finger along the topographic lines, imagining Daniel's careful plotting, the rehearsed steps, the pre-cut ropes, the deliberate placement. The detective could feel the methodical mind behind the chaos, a mind that treated death not as an accident, but a precise, controlled event. As night deepened outside, Hale whispered to himself, "We know what happened. Now we just have to find him." The mountains loomed beyond the office window, indifferent to human investigation, yet their silence carried the echo of preparation, planning, and execution, a whisper of Daniel Hart's mastery over both the wilderness and the terrible act that had unfolded within it. Detective Simon Hale woke to a gray dawn that draped the Granite Crown Range in a mist so thick it seemed to swallow sound. The mountains felt alive in a way that both fascinated and unnerved him. He assembled a small tactical team and began retracing the concealed routes Daniel Hart had mapped. The goal wasn't just to follow footprints, it was to understand the deliberate choreography of the crime. Each cairn, each trampled patch of grass, each precise placement of stones formed a language Daniel had written for no one but himself. Hale could feel the quiet precision in every step, a frozen narrative of control, rehearsal, and obsession. Forensic reports continued to yield revelations. Rope fragments collected from the summit matched fibers from Daniel's climbing kit with near-perfect accuracy. The pre-cut lengths, the identical abrasions, the tiny nick marks all pointed to deliberate preparation. Hale noted the strange artistry in the work. The knots weren't merely functional, they were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if the act of binding carried a meaning beyond containment. It became increasingly clear that Daniel had spent weeks, perhaps months, rehearsing every motion, every placement, until the final execution felt like a ritual. Meanwhile, psychologist Dr. Angela Simons provided insight into the mind behind the act. "This isn't simply about grief or stress," she explained, reviewing photographs of the stone circle. "It's symbolic. Daniel wanted control over every element, from the rope to the stones. He wanted to impose a narrative on nature itself. And the fact that he rehearsed means he was capable of rational thought, fully aware of the consequences, but chose this path anyway." Hale felt a chill at her words. Rationality used for deliberate cruelty was a dangerous combination. Hale's breakthrough came when he discovered faint traces of a path Daniel had used repeatedly, footprints nearly hidden beneath leaf litter and gravel, moving away from the stone circle toward a narrow canyon. Following it, Hale and a team discovered a makeshift campsite, meticulously arranged. Rope fragments, small cooking implements, and even remnants of paper sketches suggested Daniel had lived there, hidden, while maintaining precise control over the landscape. It was as if he had inhabited both the wilderness and his own dark plan simultaneously, untouched by the world beyond. The detective realized Daniel wasn't fleeing randomly, he was performing another layer of the plan, a prolonged manipulation of his environment. Every move had meaning, every choice calculated. The mountains themselves became his stage, his allies in concealment and narrative control. Hale felt the weight of that realization. Daniel Hart had not merely committed a crime, he had choreographed it, turning both wilderness and death into instruments of his meticulous, terrifying intent. As the day ended, Hale stood at the edge of the canyon, looking at the campsite with an uneasy fascination. The mountains were silent witnesses, indifferent yet complicit in Daniel's deliberate orchestration. Hale understood that finding him would require more than tracking. It would require anticipating the mind of a man who treated reality as a rehearsal space for his own dark design. The act closed with a growing sense of urgency. Daniel Hart was out there, still in control, and every second that passed strengthened the precision of his plan. Hale knew the next encounter would be decisive, a collision of rationality and madness forged high in the granite crown peaks. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged spires of the Granite Crown Range, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the wilderness. Detective Simon Hale stood atop a rocky outcrop, scanning the tree line below where Daniel Hart was believed to be moving. The hours of tracking had been painstaking, following faint traces that seemed almost designed to mislead. Flattened moss, subtle scratches on bark, disturbed pebbles, all disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Hart had turned the mountains into a labyrinth, leaving trails that teased the investigators while demonstrating the meticulous nature of his planning. Hale's team moved carefully, each step deliberate, aware that any miscalculation could drive Hart further into hiding. The man's survival skills were formidable. He knew the terrain intimately and had prepared for months, if not years, to live off-grid. Hale thought about the stone circle, the precise knots, the pre-cut ropes, and the hidden cache. All of it pointed to a mind that anticipated every contingency. Hart wasn't reckless, he was methodical, almost surgical in his manipulation of both the environment and those searching for him. A glint caught Hale's eye in a narrow ravine below, the reflection of sunlight on metal. He signaled to his team, and they moved with quiet coordination, descending carefully into the canyon. There, partially hidden beneath a cluster of boulders, they found the remnants of Daniel's campsite. Rope fragments, some identical to those used in the bindings at the stone circle, lay coiled with precision. Nearby, sketches and maps showed triangulated positions of peaks and valleys, approach paths, and even notes on wind patterns and natural concealment. The level of foresight was staggering. Daniel had calculated the smallest details, from environmental conditions to the likely actions of law enforcement. Hale crouched beside a makeshift workstation, examining a hand-drawn map nearly identical in style to the one discovered at the cabin. The notations detailed precise measurements of the mountainside, including an exact location for the stone circle and surrounding terrain features. The deliberate repetition of symbols and annotations suggested that Hart had returned multiple times, rehearsing his plan and ensuring every step could be executed flawlessly. It wasn't more than preparation, it was obsession. Hale felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Hart's psychological control over the crime scene extended beyond the act itself, infiltrating every corner of his reality. Night fell quickly in the high peaks, bringing a biting cold that seeped through clothing and into the bones. Hale ordered the team to set up perimeter surveillance and infrared scopes to track movement. The mountains were quiet, save for the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustle of pine needles in the wind, yet the sense of being watched was palpable. Hart was aware they were closing in. The traces left behind, subtle, calculated, served as both lure and warning. Hale knew that this man was not going to be caught through brute force or random patrols. Confrontation required understanding his psychology, predicting the moves of someone who had orchestrated death and concealment with surgical precision. Hours passed in tense silence until a faint figure emerged along a narrow ridge, moving with deliberate stealth. Hale signaled, and the team prepared for engagement, but the approach was cautious, no sudden movements. Hart was emaciated but alert, his eyes scanning the terrain, his body taut with readiness. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Predator and pursuers, intelligence and obsession, each calculating the other's limits. Hale stepped forward slowly, speaking in measured tones. "Daniel Hart, it's over. You don't need to hurt anyone else." Hart froze, his gaze flicking between Hale and the surrounding peaks, a mixture of defiance and calculation in his expression. He spoke softly, almost reverently. "You don't understand. The mountains, they have rules. They demand precision." Hale recognized the familiar patterns of rationalization, the intellectualization of violence, but there was no room for negotiation. Hart had turned his environment into an extension of his mind, and now that mind had been cornered. The standoff lasted hours, each side aware of the other's capacity for action. Hart tested Hale, feigning movements that suggested escape routes, retreat, and aggression, forcing Hale to anticipate, adapt, and remain patient. Finally, under the cover of darkness and with careful coordination, Hale's team advanced from multiple angles, cutting off Hart's egress. Exhaustion and isolation began to show on Hart's face, the carefully maintained composure cracking under the pressure of a net closing with unyielding precision. When Hale approached to make the arrest, Hart's resistance was minimal, his body slackening as if acknowledging both the inevitability and the futility of his situation. Hale observed the contrast between the man who had meticulously orchestrated a ritualistic concealment and the figure before him, defeated, stripped of control by the relentless forces of law and circumstance. The rope, maps, and tools that had once symbolized mastery were now evidence, testifying to the calculated violence he had carried out. As Hale was led down from the mountains, Hale looked back at the stone circle, now illuminated by the rising moonlight. Each jagged stone, each carefully measured placement, bore silent witness to the planning and obsession that had culminated in tragedy. Hale felt the weight of justice closing in, but he also recognized the endearing enigma, the psychological calculus that had driven a man to such extremes. Even in custody, the methodical mind of Daniel Hart remained, a haunting reminder that some darkness is cultivated over years, shaped by obsession and intellect, and that the echoes of such acts linger long after the perpetrator has been restrained.